Mr. Peterson, with all due respect, have you lost your mind? The executive assistant clutched the portfolio with trembling hands as she stared at the dirty, smelly, ragged man who had just walked through the main door of America's largest restaurant chain. But this was no intruder. He was the owner. Richard Peterson, a 58-year-old billionaire, had just spent 2.5 months living on the streets of New York City. And now here he was, on the 23rd floor of his corporate building, accompanied by an equally grimy, barefoot and terrified 9-year-old boy. Leo looked around with wide eyes. Italian marble floors, paintings worth fortunes, a panoramic view of the city. 3 hours ago he had been passed out from hunger under an awning. Now he was at the center of something he couldn't comprehend. Richard didn't answer his assistant. He just held Leo's trembling hand firmly and guided him to his private office. The mahogany door closed behind them. The silence was heavy. Leo backed away, pressing himself against the wall, his eyes filled with tears and confusion. The homeless man, with whom he had shared food for weeks, now wore an invisible authority, even in filthy clothes. The contrast was jarring, the street stench mixed with the scent of new leather from the luxury furniture. Richard knelt in front of the boy, bringing himself to his level. His hands, calloused from weeks of being invisible on the streets, held Leo's fragile shoulders. And then, for the first time in 3 years, Richard Peterson cried. "You saved me," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, and you don't even know it." Leo understood nothing. His heart hammered against his ribs. Part of him wanted to run. Part of him wanted answers. Richard stood up, walked to the panoramic window, and pointed to the city below. Millions of people, thousands of cars, hundreds of his restaurants scattered across the landscape. "Do you see all this? I have more money than I can count. I can buy anything. But I couldn't buy what you gave me for free, true humanity." His voice trembled. Leo remained silent, trying to process it. How could he, a boy without even shoes on his feet, have given something valuable to a man who had everything 3 weeks earlier? The story had begun very differently, not in luxurious offices, but in the trash. Leo was kneeling behind a high-end restaurant on Fifth Avenue, rummaging through discarded leftovers. His small, dirty fingers trembled with hunger and cold. Then he found it, a takeout container, closed, still warm, with rice, beans, a steak and potatoes. Someone had thrown it away, perhaps because the meat was too rare for a refined palate. To Leo, it was a miracle. He hadn't eaten a full meal in 4 days. His stomach ached so much he could barely stand. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched the unlikely treasure to his chest. But then he heard it, a faint groan coming from 10 feet to his left. Leo turned his head and saw an old man slumped near another trash can, shivering. He looked even weaker than Leo, with pale skin and chapped lips. A homeless man, older, more vulnerable, closer to death. Leo's eyes darted from the container to the man, from the container back to the man. Hunger screamed inside him. Every cell in his body begged him to eat it all by himself, quickly, before someone could steal it. But then, a voice echoed in his memory. His mother's voice, 2 years ago, before she died. "Leo, my son, always share what you have, even if it's just a little. Because it's when you have nothing that you show who you really are." Leo squeezed his eyes shut. His hands tightened around the container. The internal battle was brutal, survival versus humanity. He was 9 years old and making a decision that many adults wouldn't have the courage to make. Then, slowly, he stood up. His wobbly legs barely supported him. He walked over to the old man, crouched beside him, and with a trembling voice said, "Mister, are you hungry? I found some food we can share." The man slowly opened his eyes. They were dark, deep, and filled with something Leo couldn't identify. The homeless man, who was actually Richard Peterson in disguise, felt something shatter inside his chest. In that moment, he was no longer testing humanity. He was witnessing a miracle. Richard had spent 2 months on the streets being ignored, cursed at, kicked and spat on. Volunteers from non-profits treated him like a statistic. So-called good people looked away. Security guards chased him off. No one, absolutely no one, had offered him anything genuine without wanting something in return. And now, a 9-year-old boy, starving, fragile, on the verge of collapse, was offering half of his only meal. Richard wanted to refuse. He wanted to reveal everything right then and there. But something stopped him. He needed to see how far this kindness went. He needed to know if it was real. So, in a weak, hoarse voice, he accepted, "Thank you, son. God bless you." Leo smiled, a small but genuine smile. And there, amongst the trash cans and rats, 2 human beings, separated by billions of dollars but united by hunger, shared a takeout container. They ate in silence. Leo gave the largest portion to the old man. He kept only a few spoonfuls of rice and a small piece of meat for himself. When he finished, he wiped his mouth on the sleeve of his torn hoodie and looked at Richard with concern. "Do you have a place to sleep tonight? It's going to be really cold." Richard nearly broke character. He almost screamed the truth, but he held back. "No, I don't, son." "And you?" Leo shrugged. "I sleep under that awning over there. The security guard lets us stay until about 11. Then we have to leave. But I know some other spots." He hesitated, then added shyly, "If you want, and we can share the blanket I found last week. It's small, but it's big enough for 2. That night, Richard Peterson, a man accustomed to sleeping in imported king-size beds with 1,000-thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets, slept on a cold sidewalk, sharing a thin, dirty blanket with a street kid. He couldn't sleep a wink, not from physical discomfort, but from emotional shock. Leo slept curled up beside him, shivering from the cold even under the blanket. And Richard realized something devastating. That boy had absolutely nothing, yet he was willing to share everything, while he, Richard, had billions, but had become incapable of feeling or offering anything real. Shame and admiration churned in his chest. Before dawn, Richard made a decision. He would continue the disguise. He needed to know more about this boy. He needed to understand where so much light came from in the midst of so much darkness. Now, 3 weeks later, the truth had been revealed, and Leo was there in the billionaire's office trying to process the impossible. Richard turned from the window and looked at the boy. "For 3 weeks, you shared your food with me. You gave me shelter. You talked to me like I mattered. You didn't know who I was. You expected no reward. You did it all because your heart is pure." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. "My son died 3 years ago, and I died with him. I stopped believing in goodness until you proved me wrong." Leo finally spoke, his voice small but steady. "I didn't do anything special, mister. I just did what my mom taught me." And Richard replied, kneeling again, "You did everything. You reminded me why life is worth living." Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching from. We love to know. But to fully understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning. 3 weeks and 4 days before that moment in the office, Leo woke up in his home, an awning on a side street near Times Square. It was 5:30 in the morning. The sun hadn't risen yet. The cold cut through his skin. Leo huddled under the thin blanket he had found in a donation bin days earlier. Around him, 4 other homeless people slept in uncomfortable positions. One of them, Old Man Joe, snored loudly. Mrs. Rita, a 60-year-old woman, coughed incessantly. Leo knew that cough well. It was pneumonia, but no one went to the hospital. No one had documents. No one was seen. Leo was 9, but he felt 50 on the inside. His brown eyes carried a weariness that children shouldn't know. He had been on the streets for exactly 2 years, 3 months, and 8 days. He counted. His mother, Clara, had died from complications of untreated diabetes. They had no money for medicine, no family, nowhere to go. When she died in the hallway of a public hospital, waiting for care that never came, Leo was left alone. No relatives ever showed up. Social services tried to take him to a shelter, but Leo ran away after 3 days. The shelter was violent, kids were beaten, food was stolen. He preferred the street. But Leo wasn't like the others. He had something rare on the streets: principles. He never stole, even when starving. He never lied to get money. He never got involved with drugs, even when other boys offered something to forget the pain. He asked for money at traffic lights with honesty. "Mr. Ma'am, I'm hungry. Anything helps." Some gave, most ignored him, but Leo didn't give up. Every night, before sleeping, he would look up at the sky and talk to his mother. "Mom, I'm trying to be good like you taught me. It's hard, but I'm not giving up." That conversation was what kept him human. On that specific morning, Leo got up early because he had a plan. Every Thursday, the Italian restaurant on 5th Avenue threw out still good food in the back alley. If he got there early, before the other homeless people and before the garbage trucks, he might find something. He folded his blanket carefully, even though it was old, it was all he had, and hid it under a piece of cardboard, marking the spot with a rock. Mrs. Rita woke up and looked at him. "Going to look for food, son?" Leo nodded. She smiled sadly. "Be careful. The security guards have been crankier this week." Leo knew. John, the local security guard, had been given orders to cleanse the area of homeless people. That meant aggression and humiliation. Leo walked through the still deserted streets of New York City. The city was beginning to wake up, bakers opening their doors, bus drivers starting their routes, janitors cleaning sidewalks. But no one saw Leo. He was invisible, a 9-year-old ghost wandering among the living, belonging nowhere. When he reached 5th Avenue, the contrast was jarring. Designer stores with illuminated windows, imported cars parked at the curb, the smell of gourmet coffee wafting from cafes that charged $10 for a cappuccino. Leo walked right past, heading for the alley behind the Italian restaurant. And that's when he saw it, the dumpster in the back, still full. His heart raced. He approached cautiously, looking around to make sure no one saw him, and then he started to rummage. Leo's hands were dirty and bruised, with small cuts that never fully healed. He pushed aside plastic bags, packaging scraps, vegetable peels. And then, at the bottom, he found the treasure, a closed takeout container still warm. His hands trembled as he picked it up. He opened it slowly, as if it were sacred. White rice, black beans, a grilled steak, golden potatoes, a side salad. To anyone else, it was just an ordinary meal. To Leo, it was a miracle. Tears streamed from his eyes. For 4 days, he had eaten nothing but stale bread someone had given him. His stomach ached so much he could barely sleep at night. And now, here was the solution to his pain. But just as Leo was about to close the container and run to a safe place to eat, he heard a sound. A low, weak, desperate groan. Leo froze. He slowly turned his head to the left, and he saw him, an old man, slumped between 2 dumpsters about 10 feet away. He was motionless except for his trembling, torn, dirty clothes, a long, tangled beard. Pale skin, he looked like he was on the brink of death. Leo knew that look. He had seen it in his mother weeks before she passed. It was the look of someone who was giving up. Leo's eyes darted from the container to the man. From the container to the man. His heart was in conflict. Hunger screamed inside him, but something else screamed louder. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Always share what you have, Leo, even if it's just a little." Leo took a deep breath. He squeezed his eyes shut, and he made the hardest decision of his short life. He clutched the container to his chest, stood up on shaky legs, and walked over to the man. He crouched beside him and, in a voice that was trembling but firm, said, "Mister, "Are you okay? I found some food here. We can share if you want." The man slowly opened his eyes. They were dark, deep, and for a second Leo saw something he couldn't identify. Tears. The homeless man, Richard Peterson in disguise, looked at this dirty, barefoot, skeletal boy holding a takeout container as if it were gold, and something inside him broke. During 2 months on the streets, no one had offered him anything real, and now a boy who could barely stand was offering half of his only meal. Richard tried to speak, but emotion choked his voice. He could only nod. Leo sat down next to the old man. He opened the container and carefully divided the food in half, using a plastic fork he found in the trash. He gave the larger portion to Richard. More rice, more beans, the entire steak. He kept only a few spoonfuls and the potatoes for himself. "You need this more than I do, mister. You're weaker." Richard looked at the absurdly generous division and felt the urge to scream the truth, to reveal everything, to end this painful charade. But something stopped him. He had to know, was this real, or was the boy just being clever, manipulative, hoping for something in return later? So Richard accepted the food and ate in silence. Leo ate slowly, chewing each bite as if it were his last. And perhaps it was. When they finished, Leo wiped his mouth on the sleeve of his torn hoodie and asked with genuine concern, "Do you have a place to sleep tonight, mister? It's going to get pretty cold." Richard looked at this boy, this impossible boy, this boy who had just shared his only meal with a stranger and was now worried about his shelter. Richard Peterson, who owned 127 properties across the country, who slept on imported orthopedic mattresses, who had never had to worry about being cold in his life, was being offered shelter by a street kid. The irony was so brutal, it was almost physically painful. In a hoarse voice, Richard replied, "No, I don't, son. And you?" Leo shrugged, trying to look brave. "I've got an awning over on a street near Times Square. The security guard lets us stay until about 11. Then we have to leave. But I also know some spots under the bridge." He hesitated, looking down at his own bare feet, and then added shyly, "If you want, we can share my blanket. It's small, but I think it's big enough for two." And in that moment, Richard Peterson decided he would continue the disguise. He had to understand this boy. He had to know if there was still light left in the world. That night changed everything. Richard and Leo slept side by side on the cold sidewalk, sharing the thin blanket that barely covered them. Richard didn't close his eyes. He just stared up at the dark New York sky, too polluted to show any stars, wondering how he had gotten here. Billionaire, successful entrepreneur, devastated father, and now a liar. Because that's what he was, a liar in disguise, testing the kindness of an innocent child. The guilt weighed on his chest like concrete, but he couldn't stop. He had to know if this was real, if Leo was real. Leo slept curled up like a wounded animal, shivering even under the blanket. His lips murmured incomprehensible words, probably talking to his mother in his dreams. Richard watched the boy and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Maybe there was still goodness in the world. Maybe his son Jonathan had been right when he said that people were good at heart, just lost. Maybe Richard had given up on humanity too soon. When the sun began to rise, Leo woke with a start, as he always did, a reflex of someone living in constant alert. He looked to his side and saw Richard was still there. He hadn't run off during the night with the blanket. Leo smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Good morning, mister. Sleep well." The question was so innocent, so human, that Richard almost broke. He almost confessed everything right then and there, but he swallowed the words and answered in a hoarse voice, "I did, son. Thanks for sharing your blanket." Leo stood up, folded the blanket carefully, and hid it under the marked piece of cardboard. "Today's Friday. There's a bakery over on Lexington Avenue that sometimes gives away stale bread at the end of the day. If we go early, we can get some before the others." He looked at Richard with concern. "Can you walk? It's about a 15-minute walk from here." Richard nodded. And then, for the first time in decades, a billionaire followed a street kid through the sidewalks of New York City in search of stale bread. The journey was revealing. Leo knew every alley, every dumpster, every shopkeeper who opened early. He greeted the other homeless people by name. "Morning, old man Joe. Morning, Mrs. Rita." Some people answered, others ignored him, but Leo never failed to greet them. When they passed a newsstand, the vendor, a man in his 50s named Nelson, waved. "Hey, Leo, who's that with you?" Leo introduced him. "He's a new friend, Mr. Nelson. He needs some help." Nelson looked at Richard suspiciously, but said nothing. He just handed 2 bread rolls to Leo. "Here, kid. Left over from yesterday." Leo thanked him profusely and immediately shared a roll with Richard. As they walked, Richard asked questions. He wanted to know this boy. "Leo, how long have you been on the street?" Leo answered without drama. 2 years and 3 months, more or less. My mum died and I didn't have anyone else." Richard felt a stab in his chest. "And you never thought about stealing? To get food?" Leo stopped walking and looked at Richard with a seriousness beyond his 9 years. "My mum always said we can lose everything in life, our home, our money, our health. But if we lose our dignity, we become someone else. I don't want to become someone else, mister. I want to stay the Leo my mom raised." In that moment, Richard Peterson, who had interviewed hundreds of executives and entrepreneurs in his life, realized he was in the presence of one of the most principled people he had ever met. They arrived at the bakery. A small line of homeless people was already waiting out back. The baker, an old Italian man named Joseph, was handing out bags of day-old bread. When it was Leo's turn, Joseph smiled. "Hey, Leo, got 2 whole loaves for you today, kid. You don't steal, you don't cause trouble, you deserve it." Leo thanked him and without hesitation gave one of the loaves to Richard. "Here, mister. You need to eat more. You're too thin." Richard held the bread, which to him wasn't worth even $1, but to Leo was a treasure, and felt tears threatening to escape. How was this possible? How could a boy with nothing continue to share everything? Where did he find the strength to be good in such a cruel world? They returned to the awning. Leo sat on the ground and began to eat slowly, savoring each bite as if it was sacred. Richard sat beside him. "Leo, do you have any dreams? Something you want to do when you grow up?" The boy's eyes lit up. "I want to study, mister. I want to learn to read properly, do math, that kind of stuff. My mum always said that education was the one thing nobody could ever steal from you." He looked toward the horizon, at the tall buildings of Park Avenue in the distance. "Sometimes I imagine what it would be like to have a house. It doesn't have to be big. Just a place where I could sleep without being afraid, and maybe have a dog." Richard squeezed the bread in his hands. This boy dreamed of the basic things every human deserved, and he, Richard, had 47 empty properties. That's when everything changed. Out of nowhere, a large, aggressive man approached. It was John, the security guard who cleansed the area. He pointed his nightstick at Leo. "How many times have I told you to get out of here, kid? This isn't a place for bums." Leo jumped to his feet, placing himself in front of Richard in a protective gesture. "We're leaving now, sir. Just let us finish eating, please." But John was irritated. He kicked the bread out of Richard's hand, and it fell to the dirty ground. "I said scram! You people make the street look bad, the customers complain." Richard felt anger rise within him. For the first time in 2 months, he wanted to break his cover, to reveal who he was, to humiliate this man. But then Leo did something unexpected. He bent down, picked the bread up from the ground, wiped it off with his hand, and offered it to John. "Sir, are you hungry? We can share. You don't have to be angry." The security guard froze. He stared at the dirty boy offering food to the person who had just assaulted him. For a second, something human flickered in his eyes, but then he looked away, ashamed, and grumbled, "I don't want your food, but you have 10 minutes. Then disappear from here." And he walked away. Leo sighed in relief and turned to Richard. "He's not a bad guy, mister. He's just doing his job. No point in being angry." In that exact moment, Richard made a decision. He was no longer testing Leo. He was learning from him. The following days were the most transformative of Richard Peterson's life. He continued the disguise, but now with a different purpose. It was no longer about testing humanity. It was about understanding how a 9-year-old boy had managed to keep his goodness intact despite everything. Richard followed Leo through his daily routine, waking up early, looking for food, asking for money at traffic lights, sharing with other homeless people, sleeping in the cold. And in every action, Leo demonstrated a generosity that defied all logic. One morning, Leo managed to get $5 at a stoplight. Instead of buying food for himself, he bought medicine for Mrs. Rita, whose cough was getting worse. "She needs it more than I do, mister," was all he said. Richard watched everything in silence. At night, when Leo was asleep, Richard would take out his hidden smartphone. He maintained minimal contact with his staff, just enough to ensure the company was still running, and write everything down in a digital journal. Every one of Leo's acts of kindness, every sacrifice, every wise word that didn't belong to a 9-year-old child. Richard was documenting something rare, raw, unadulterated human purity, but the more he observed, the more his guilt grew. He was deceiving this boy. He was using his trust to fuel a selfish experiment. And worse, he was starting to get attached. Leo called him Mister with genuine affection. He talked to him about his mom, about his dreams, about his fears. Richard was becoming a father figure to Leo, but it was all based on lies. Then came the moment that would change everything, the wallet incident. It was a rainy Tuesday. Leo and Richard were sheltered under the awning when Leo saw something on the ground a few feet away, a black leather wallet. He got up, picked it up, and opened it. Inside, $100 in bills, an ID, credit cards. Richard watched the entire scene unfold. This was the ultimate test. What would a starving street kid with no prospects do with $100? That money could feed him for weeks. It could buy clothes, medicine, a new blanket. No one would know. No one would blame him. Richard held his breath. Leo stared at the money for a long moment. His hands were shaking. Richard could see the internal battle taking place. But then Leo closed the wallet. He looked around for the owner. He didn't see anyone. Then he turned to Richard. "Mister, we have to find the owner. There's an ID in here. The person must be desperate." Richard could barely speak. "Leo, that's a lot of money. Don't you want to keep a little, just to buy some food?" Leo shook his head firmly. "No, mister, this isn't mine. My mom always said, no matter how much you need something, if it's not yours, you don't take it. Otherwise, you become a thief." And with that, Leo walked out from under the awning into the rain, walked 2 blocks to a police station, and turned in the wallet. The officer on duty was so surprised, he almost didn't believe it. When Leo returned, soaked and shivering from the cold, Richard was crying. This was the wow moment that broke Richard internally. There were no more doubts. Leo was real. His kindness wasn't a performance, it wasn't a strategy, it wasn't naivete. It was character, pure and simple. That night, Richard almost confessed everything. He almost revealed he was a billionaire, that he could give Leo everything he needed, that this stupid test was over. But something stopped him. Fear. Fear that Leo would pull away upon discovering the lie. Fear of losing the genuine connection that was forming. Fear that everything would fall apart. So Richard held on to the truth for one more day, and then another, and another. The lie was growing like a tumor. Meanwhile, the days grew harder, the cold intensified, the rains became more frequent. Leo started to cough, a dry, persistent cough that Richard knew well, the beginning of pneumonia. "Leo, you need to go to a hospital," Richard insisted, but Leo refused. "Hospitals don't treat people like me, mister, and I'm afraid they'll take me to the shelter." Richard felt a surge of desperation. He had unlimited resources to save this boy, but he couldn't use them without breaking his cover. He was trapped in his own web. One night, Mrs. Rita died. She simply didn't wake up. The pneumonia had taken her. Leo cried for hours beside her body, waiting for the city morgue's van to come. It was the first time Richard saw him truly broken. "Mister, I don't want to die on the street like her," Leo whispered that night, clinging to Richard. "I'm scared of dying alone." Richard held the boy tightly, feeling the crushing weight of his own cowardice. He had to do something. He had to stop this madness. But how? How could he reveal the truth without destroying the trust Leo had in him? How could he explain that everything, absolutely everything, had been an elaborate lie concocted by a billionaire in an existential crisis? Richard didn't sleep that night. He stayed up watching Leo tremble with fever beside him, and he made a decision. The next morning, he would confess everything. He would beg for forgiveness, and he would change this boy's life, even if it meant losing his friendship forever. But fate had other plans. In the early hours of the morning, Leo's fever spiked dramatically. He began to hallucinate, calling out for his mother, sweating and shivering uncontrollably. Richard panicked. There was no more time for confessions or explanations. He grabbed his hidden phone and, for the first time in 2 months, made a call as Richard Peterson. "Mark, it's me. Send a private ambulance now to the awning in front of 847 Augusta Street. Total discretion. It's urgent." 10 minutes later, an ambulance arrived. The paramedics placed Leo on a stretcher. The boy, semi-conscious, clung to Richard's hand. "Mister, don't leave me." Richard climbed into the ambulance. "I won't leave you, son. Never." And in that moment, as the siren cut through the New York dawn, Richard knew the truth was about to explode, and there was no controlling the fallout. Leo woke up in another world. His eyes opened slowly to a soft white light that wasn't the harsh glare of the sun on the street. The ceiling was white, clean, with modern light fixtures. The smell wasn't of urine and garbage, but of antiseptic and clean linens. He was lying in a bed, a real bed with a soft mattress, white sheets and pillows. Leo blinked several times, confused. Where was he? What had happened? He tried to sit up, but his body was weak, connected to IV drips and monitors. Then the door opened. A man Leo didn't immediately recognize walked in, clean shaven, wearing an impeccable navy blue suit. But the eyes were the same. "Mister?" Leo whispered, disbelieving. Richard approached the bed, his own hands shaking. He had planned this moment 100 times in his head over the past few days. He had rehearsed words, apologies, explanations. But now, looking at the fragile boy in the hospital bed, the words failed him. Leo stared back at him with a mixture of confusion, fear, and something that looked like betrayal. You're not homeless?" Leo's voice was small, broken. Richard sat in the chair beside the bed, keeping his distance so as not to frighten him further. "No, Leo, I'm not." The silence that followed was as heavy as concrete. Leo looked away, his gaze fixed on the white sheets. Tears began to stream from his eyes. So it was all a lie? The pain in that question was a knife in Richard's heart. He leaned forward, desperate to explain. "Leo, listen to me, please. I can explain everything." But Leo shook his head, still not looking at him. "You lied. I trusted you. I shared everything I had. And you were just... what? Testing me? Like I was some kind of experiment?" Every word was a righteous accusation. Richard felt tears burn his own eyes. "Yes," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Yes, in the beginning it was a test. I wanted to know if true goodness still existed in the world. But Leo, you changed everything. You saved me. Leo finally looked at him and his eyes were full of hurt. "I didn't save anyone, mister. I was just stupid." Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. He was losing Leo, losing the one pure thing he had found in years. "You weren't stupid," Richard insisted, his voice trembling. "You were human. More human than anyone I have ever met in my entire life. You shared food that wasn't even yours. You returned money that could have changed your life. You cared for a stranger as if he were family." He paused, wiping his own tears. "My name is Richard Peterson. I own the largest restaurant chain in America. I have billions, but I was dead inside. My son died 3 years ago and I died with him, until you showed me that life was still worth living." Leo processed the information slowly. Billionaire, restaurant chain, elaborate lie. His 9-year-old mind struggled to make sense of it. "So you have money to buy food, but you watched me starve?" The question was simple, devastating. Richard had no good answer. "I know it doesn't make sense," he admitted. "I know it was selfish, cruel, but I needed to know if it was real, if you were real." Leo was silent for a long time. Then, in a cold voice that didn't belong to a child, he said, "I want to leave. I want to go back to the street." Richard panicked. "Leo, you're sick. You have pneumonia. You need treatment." But Leo was already trying to pull out his IV. "I don't need anything from you. You lied. I don't trust you anymore." Just then, the door opened again. A woman in her 50s walked in, carrying a bouquet of flowers. It was Mrs. Davis, the flower vendor who sometimes helped Leo on the streets. She looked from the bed to Richard, her face showing no surprise. "Hi, Leo, my angel. How are you?" Leo stared at her, confused. "Mrs. Davis, how did you know I was here?" She came closer, sitting on the other side of the bed. "Mr. Peterson called me, sweetie. He asked me to come talk to you." Leo frowned. "You know him?" Mrs. Davis smiled sadly and nodded. "I do. I worked in his restaurants for 15 years, until I retired." The revelation left Leo even more bewildered. Mrs. Davis took his small hand. "Leo, I know you're hurt, and you have every right to be, but I need to tell you something about Mr. Peterson." She glanced at Richard, who nodded for her to continue. 3 years ago, his son Jonathan died. He was 19, a beautiful boy with a good heart, always doing volunteer work. When he died, Mr. Peterson died inside too. I saw it happen. He became empty, bitter, sad. He stopped believing in people. Tears streamed down Mrs. Davis's face. He was so desperate to find goodness again that he did this crazy thing, going to the streets. Was it wrong? Yes. But he didn't do it to hurt you, honey. He did it because he was dying inside. Leo looked at Richard, who was crying silently. For the first time, Leo didn't see a lying billionaire, but a shattered father, a broken man trying to piece himself back together. "Your son, was he nice?" Leo asked in a small voice. Richard nodded, unable to speak. Mrs. Davis answered for him. "He was wonderful, Leo. He was a lot like you know, not physically, but in his spirit, in his heart. Jonathan never stole, always helped everyone, always believed in the best in people." She squeezed Leo's hand. "I think when Mr. Peterson met you, he saw his son again. He saw that there are still good people in the world." Leo was quiet, processing. He was young, but he wasn't foolish. He understood pain. He understood loss. He had lost his own mother, after all. He looked at Richard and saw something he recognized, the same pain he felt every night when he remembered his mom. "Do you still think about him every day?" Leo asked. Richard nodded. "Every day, every hour." Leo looked down at his own hands. "I think about my mom like that too. It hurts a lot." And in that moment, something shifted. The anger didn't disappear completely, but it was joined by understanding. Leo took a deep breath. "You shouldn't have lied. It was wrong. Richard agreed immediately. It was very wrong, and I am so sorry, Leo. Truly. But then Leo added something that broke Richard. But I understand why you did it. When the pain is that big, people do crazy things. Tears were now flowing freely down both their faces. Richard knelt by the bed, holding Leo's hand. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. You reminded me that there is still light in the world. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve anything. But please let me take care of you, not as a test, not as an experiment, but as someone who truly loves you. The silence that followed was broken by Leo. You love me? Richard nodded. I do, son, like you were my own. But forgiveness didn't come easily. In the following days, Leo remained in the hospital being treated for pneumonia. Richard visited every day, bringing food, books, and toys. But Leo kept an emotional distance. He spoke little. He answered in monosyllables. The wound of betrayal was still open and raw. One afternoon, Richard arrived at the room to find Leo staring out the window, watching the city below. What are you thinking about? Richard asked gently. Leo didn't turn around. About the others. Old Man Joe, Mrs. Rita. I mean, she's gone now. But the others. They're still out there on the street, cold and hungry, and I'm here in a warm bed with food every day. There was guilt in his voice. Richard came closer. You feel bad for being better off than them? Leo nodded. It's not fair. They're good people too. Why do I get this chance? Richard sat beside him and said something that would change everything. What if we could help them too, you and me, together? Leo finally looked at him. How? Richard smiled for the first time in days. I have money, Leo, a lot of money. Money that means nothing if it's not used for something good. What if we create a place where people like Old Man Joe, like you, like everyone living on the streets, can have food, a bed, medical care? Leo's eyes lit up for the first time. A shelter? Richard shook his head. No, shelters treat people like numbers. I want to create something different, a place with dignity, where people are seen, heard, and truly cared for. And you're going to help me plan it, because you know what they need. You've lived it. Leo was silent, processing the offer. Then, in a voice that was still wary but curious, he asked, And if I agree, does that mean we'll be, like, family? Richard's heart clenched. Only if you want that, Leo. I will never force anything, but yes, I would very much like for you to be my son. But in that exact moment, everything fell apart. The door burst open. A social worker entered, accompanied by a court officer. Richard Peterson? She asked formally. Richard stood up. Yes? She handed him some documents. I've received an anonymous tip that you are keeping a child without legal guardianship. I need to take Leo for an evaluation and possibly to a shelter while the situation is sorted out. The world stopped. Leo's face went pale. No, I don't want to go to the shelter, please. He looked at Richard in a panic. Don't let them take me, please. Richard felt pure rage. He stepped forward. You are not taking him. The social worker sighed. Mr. Peterson, I understand you have good intentions, but the law is clear. You do not have legal custody of this child. Richard pulled out his phone. I'm calling the best lawyers in the country right now. I will begin adoption proceedings immediately. She shook her head. The adoption process can take months, even years. In the meantime, the child must be in proper custody. Leo started to cry. I don't want to. The shelter is horrible. They hit us. Please. He jumped out of bed, too weak and nearly collapsed. Richard caught him. In that moment of desperation, Leo made his choice. He hugged Richard tightly, burying his face in his chest. Don't let them take me, Dad, please. The word Dad landed like a lightning bolt. Richard froze. Leo had just called him Dad. Not Mr. Peterson. Dad. Richard hugged the boy fiercely, tears streaming down his face. "I won't let them, son. I promise." He looked at the social worker with a determination that came from billions of dollars and immense influence. "You will leave now. My lawyers will be in touch. You are not taking my son." The social worker hesitated. She looked at Leo, clinging to Richard, saw the genuine love there, but she also had rules to follow. "Mr. Peterson, if you interfere, I can call the police." Richard picked up his phone again. "Then I'll call first. Judge Michael Sanders, who was my college roommate and owes me a few favors. Then I'll call the 3 congressmen whose last campaigns I financed. And then I'll call every newspaper in the country and tell them this story. How social services wants to rip a sick child from the arms of someone who wants to adopt and care for him." His voice was cold, corporate, powerful. "Do you want to deal with that storm?" The silence was tense. The social worker glanced at the court officer, who shrugged. She sighed. "All right, I will give you 72 hours to begin the legal process for temporary guardianship. If there is nothing filed in 72 hours, I will be back with an official warrant." Richard nodded. "Everything will be in order within 48 hours. You can count on it." She made a note and left with the officer. When the door closed, Richard and Leo collapsed into each other, hugging, crying, finally together with no lies between them. "You called me Dad," Richard whispered. Leo looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I'm still hurt about the lies, but I think everyone deserves a second chance. My mom always said that." Richard held Leo's small face between his hands. "I don't deserve you, Leo, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to. I will be the best father I can possibly be. I promise." Leo gave a small smile, the first genuine one since he'd learned the truth. "Then you'll have to teach me how to read properly, and get me a dog, and we're going to help Old Man Joe and the others." Richard laughed through his tears. "All of it, anything you want." And there, in that hospital room, amidst IV drips and monitors, a family was born, not of blood, but of choice, of love, of forgiveness, of second chances that changed destinies. 1 year later. Leo's life had changed in ways he couldn't even fully process. He woke up every day in a king-size bed, in a room decorated with soccer posters and shelves full of books. But what made him smile the most was the sound of paws pattering down the hallway. Thor, his 8-month-old golden retriever, who jumped on the bed every morning to lick his face. Leo would laugh, hug the dog and think, "Mom, do you see this? I got the dog we always dreamed of." The pain of her loss would never completely vanish, but it was now accompanied by gratitude. Gratitude for being alive, for having a second chance, for finding a father when he least expected it. Richard's mornings were different too. He would come downstairs and see Leo eating breakfast, dressed in the uniform for the private school he now attended. He would see his son, because that's what Leo was now, officially adopted 6 months ago, chatting with the housekeeper about his homework, and Richard felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose. He wasn't just existing, he was alive. "Good morning, son." Leo looked up and smiled. "Morning, Dad. Are you taking me to school today?" Richard nodded. "I am. And afterwards we'll stop by the institute. The new wing is opening today." Leo's eyes sparkled. "Really? The wing with the rooms for families?" Richard smiled. "The very same." The Clara Mendes Institute had become a reality. Richard had converted 3 of his former restaurants into support centers for people experiencing homelessness. But they weren't typical shelters. They were spaces with dignity, private rooms, private bathrooms, new clothes, medical and psychological treatment, and job training programs. And most importantly, every person was treated by name, listened to, and respected. Leo had insisted the institute be named after his mother. "She always wanted to help everyone, Dad. Now she's helping through us." Richard couldn't refuse. The plaque at the entrance read, the Clara Mendez Institute, where dignity finds hope. In the first 6 months, they had already helped 247 people. Of those, 89 were already back in the workforce. Old Man Joe was one of those success stories. The old homeless man who used to sleep on the same sidewalk as Leo now worked as a cook in one of Richard's restaurants. He had his own apartment, paid off, a gift from Richard. Every week, Old Man Joe would visit Leo. "Hey kid, are you studying hard?" Leo would always answer with a hug. "I am, Mr. Joe. And you? Are you enjoying the job?" The old man's eyes would well up with tears. "I love it, son. After 15 years on the street, I have a home, I have a job, I have my dignity back." These conversations reminded Leo and Richard daily of why it all mattered, why they couldn't stop. But not everything in that year was easy. Leo had to learn to trust again. He had frequent nightmares in the first few months, waking up screaming, thinking he was still on the street. Richard would always rush to his room, hold him and repeat, "You're safe, son. I'm here. You will never be cold or hungry again." Therapy helped. Slowly, Leo began to believe that this was real, that it wasn't a dream that would suddenly end. He made friends at school, something he thought was impossible, afraid of being rejected for having been homeless. But when he told his story in a school essay, his classmates embraced him. Some even cried. The teacher asked for permission to publish the essay in the school newspaper. Leo agreed. He wasn't ashamed of his past. He was proud of his survival. Richard had to learn too. He had to learn to be a real father, not just a provider. He made many mistakes, spoiling Leo too much at first, then being too strict to compensate. But Leo taught him with a patience that belied his 10 years. "Dad, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be here." Those words were like a balm. Richard learned to play video games. He was terrible. To help with math homework. He discovered he had forgotten fractions, and to make burnt popcorn while they watched movies on Saturdays. He learned that family wasn't about grand gestures, but about small moments, about being present, about choosing every single day to love and be loved. The story leaked to the media 6 months after the adoption. An investigative journalist discovered Richard's social experiment and published an article with a sensational headline, "Billionaire used street kid in cruel test of kindness." The backlash was brutal. Social media was on fire. Half the people defended Richard, saying the outcome, saving Leo and creating the institute, justified the means. The other half crucified him, calling him a narcissist, cruel and manipulative. Richard was devastated. Sitting in his living room, watching the notifications explode on his phone, he whispered to Leo, "I've ruined everything. I've ruined you." But Leo, sitting beside him, responded with wisdom beyond his years. "Dad, everyone's going to have an opinion, but only we know what really happened. And the truth is, you saved me, and I saved you." Leo asked to do an interview. Richard initially refused, wanting to protect him. But Leo insisted. "I want to tell my side, Dad. I want people to know that love can come from the strangest places." The interview aired on a major TV network. Leo, now 10 years old, sitting next to Richard, told everything. The street, the hunger, meeting the homeless man, sharing the meal, the betrayal, the forgiveness, the family. When the host asked, "Leo, do you regret meeting Richard?" the boy answered without hesitation, "No. Because if I hadn't met him, I'd probably be dead, and the institute wouldn't exist. And Old Man Joe would still be on the street, and so would 246 other people." The studio fell silent. Then, applause. The interview went viral. Over 30 million views in 1 week. The impact was immense. Business leaders from across the country began calling Richard, asking how they could replicate the Clara Mendez Institute model in their cities. Within 3 months, 7 more institutes were opened in Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, Houston, Phoenix, Philadelphia, and Detroit, each with the same model: dignity, not charity. people treated as human beings, not as numbers. Politicians began using the story as an example of social responsibility. Nonprofits asked for consulting. The story of Leo and Richard became a symbol that second chances can change the world. But for them, none of that mattered as much as the routine they had built. Breakfast together, homework, walks with Thor, visits to the institute, bedtime talks about their day. One Sunday afternoon, a year and 2 months after they met, Richard and Leo were at the park. Thor was chasing a ball. Leo was laughing, trying to keep up with the dog. Richard watched from a bench, a genuine smile on his face. Then Leo ran back and sat beside him, out of breath. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Richard nodded. "Always, son." Leo got serious. "If you could go back, would you do it all differently, without the lies?" Richard thought for a long moment before answering. "Yes and no. The lies were wrong. I should have been honest from the start. But I wouldn't change the outcome, because you're here. You're my son, and we're saving lives together." Leo nodded, satisfied with the answer. Then he added, "You know what my mom used to say? That God writes straight with crooked lines. I think that's what happened with us." Richard felt tears in his eyes. He hugged Leo. "Your mother was a wise woman, and I'm sure she is so proud of you." They sat there, hugging, watching Thor destroy the ball. Father and son, not by blood, but by choice, by forgiveness, by a love born in the most unlikely of places, between dumpsters, over a shared container of old food, in the absurd gesture of a boy who had everything to lose and still chose to share. Months later, Leo turned 11. Richard threw a party at the Clara Mendez Institute. Not a lavish party, but a community celebration. All the residents were invited, former homeless people who now had jobs, volunteers, staff. Old Man Joe made the cake, a 3-tiered chocolate cake. Mrs. Helen, who had been rescued from the streets with pneumonia just like Leo, sang "Happy Birthday" with a voice trembling with emotion. When Leo blew out the candles, Richard asked, "What did you wish for?" Leo smiled. "I can't tell, or it won't come true, but it has to do with more people being saved." That was the essence of Leo. Even after gaining everything, he thought of others. After the party, when everyone had left, and only Richard and Leo were cleaning up the last of the plates, the boy looked out the institute window. Outside on the street, he saw another boy, dirty, barefoot, rummaging in a trash can. Leo froze. "Dad, look!" Richard walked over and saw him. His heart tightened. Leo was already moving toward the door. "I'm going to talk to him." Richard placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you sure?" Leo nodded. "I am. Because if someone hadn't talked to me that day, I wouldn't be here." And then Leo walked outside. He walked over to the boy. He crouched down beside him. And he said the same words that had changed his life. "Hi, are you hungry? There's food inside. We can share." Richard watched from the window, tears streaming freely down his face. The cycle was continuing. Kindness was multiplying. Jonathan, his son, who had died 3 years ago, had always said, "Dad, one act of kindness creates infinite ripples." He was right. Leo had created ripples, and those ripples were now reaching another lost boy, and then another, and another. Richard picked up the phone and called Mrs. Davis, the former flower vendor who now managed the institute. "Maria, we need one more spot. There's a boy here who needs help." She replied, "There's always room for one more, Mr. Peterson. Always." The sun was setting over New York City. On the awning where Leo used to sleep, now empty, there was a small, discreet plaque. Here began a story of love, forgiveness, and second chances. The Clara Mendez Institute, 1-800-XXXXX. If you need help, call. You are not alone. Every day that number received calls. Every day more lives were saved. And it was all because a 9-year-old boy with nothing in the world decided to share a meal with a stranger. Sometimes the greatest miracles are born from the smallest gestures. Sometimes saving someone means being saved too. And sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family that chose you. Richard and Leo went home that night, together as always. Thor greeted them at the door, jumping with excitement. The house smelled of a home-cooked dinner. Life was simple, but it was full. "Dad!" Leo called out before heading up to his room. "Yes, son? Thank you for everything." Richard smiled, his eyes wet with tears. "No, thank you, Leo. You gave me my life back." And so, under the same sky that had once seemed so dark and hopeless, two broken souls who found each other in the trash built something beautiful, a family, not perfect but real, not without pain, but full of love. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.